Hi everybody. Recently, I see that the topic of Metalness workflow is getting increasingly more and more attention, so I thought we might go through it together and also briefly talk about post-production in Fusion. That being said, I want to give credit where it's due and thank Abdul Mustafa for the CAD model of this Otto Octavius inspired arm. You can find a link to his original model down below. Alright, let's get started. Probably the most important point of the setup in Cinema 4D was the cleanup and the preparation of the CAD model, so it's properly set up for the texture creation in Mixer. That includes quick retopo and okayish UV unwrapping of the individual parts. The reason I'm saying that the UVs are somewhat okayish is because they were made with this shot in mind, and this means the emphasis was on everything that was either going to be directly visible or influence the shot in some way. Optimizations like these are definitely not great, but they help quite a lot if you're on a tight schedule. Alright, once I have an idea of the composition I'm after, it's time to move on to the shading. After I import the model in Mixer, I have all mesh elements grouped by their materials, and I can start working on shading the individual layers. We can isolate a part so we can take a closer look. Let's just focus on the base layer in the body texture set. Since we will focus on the Metalness workflow, I have already set the Metalness color of the base layer to white, so that we have the proper viewport representation of our shader. That's basically saying to Mixer that this material layer should be treated as a metal. We could always do that in our vray shader afterwards, but that would have us working kinda blind in Mixer. I have mostly used smart materials and constrained them with different blending modes and masks. Let's just navigate to the online tab and you can start browsing all available shaders there. Let me quickly download a couple and we can see how they look on our mesh. We could use the box projection or simply switch to the UVs we have. Once we choose a material, it's all about blending it the way you feel it will work best for your custom mesh. Okay, let me hide those two and let's move on to exporting the textures out of Mixer and start building our materials back in Cinema 4D. Oh, and by the way, a nifty shortcut to preview your model with different lighting here in Mixer is moving your mouse while holding the shift and the right mouse button. This will rotate the light source and give you a better understanding of your shaders in Mixer. Just keep in mind that the lighting here is for preview purposes only, and your model will look differently afterwards. Alright, make sure to select the Metalness preset and to mark the texture you want to be exported. At this point, you could also change the final resolution of the bitmaps. I will keep mine at 2K, but it's just useful to know that you can change the resolution right here before you do an export. Alright, let me make sure vray GPU is set for my renderer and that I have Intel's denoiser on so we can have a faster previews. The one other option I want to mention is that I have a material override setup, and I need to make sure that my newly created node material is inside of that exclusion list, so it doesn't get overridden. Okay, let me fire up an interactive render and we can start building our material. I have a close-up camera which will let us focus on that part more easily. And let me just drag an additional attribute manager to the side of the node editor, so I don't have to do those tediously long mouse movements. Alright, now I can simply do a search in my texture folder and drag and drop the textures for this part of the metal arm. Albedo goes straight to the diffuse slot, and I often tend to connect my textures to a color corrector, even if I end up not using it at the end. It just gives me that instant customization options whenever I need them. Okay, moving to the reflections. If I simply set my Metalness value to 1, I will be telling vray that this is a conductive material. In our case though, that will be driven with the Metalness texture we already exported from Mixer. Here we go. And that texture, depending on its black and white shades, will set the value for us. Let's just hook up our normal map too. And make sure to change its color space to linear so that we can properly read and load its full range of stored information. I always tend to go overboard and then dial back its value from there. Something around 1.6 or so should look alright. Okay, only one left to connect. Make sure to keep an eye on the interactive rendering. Suddenly our metal looks more like a stone of some sort. That's because we have the Roughness map connected to a Glossiness shader. We could either try to remap the texture or simply tell vray to use Roughness for this material's reflections. Now, we can still use the Remap Node, but at this time only for artistic purposes. As you can see, tweaking the curve can generate pretty interesting looks. But most importantly, we still have quite a lot of creative freedom even after we have exported our textures out of Mixer. Okay, lastly, let me just try to add just a tad more color and contrast to the diffuse texture. Alright, all the rest of the materials are created pretty much the same way, so I'm not gonna make you watch the same process all over again. Here is the final state of the scene. And before we move on to DaVinci, let me show you the render setup. I'm rendering the scene on the GPU and the render settings are pretty much left on default. One important change I made is to set my denoiser back to vray denoiser and to make sure that it only generates the render elements. This way, if I feel like we need to do some denoising, we can do that in post-production too. And these are the render elements I set up, from which I want to point out LightMix, since we are going to use the lights to change the mood later on. Okay, let's see what we have in Resolve. On the left viewer, I have the raw render out of C4D, and on the right one, I have the finished comp. Just want to make clear that the stream on top is the same setup as the one below, but instead of having a single image, it has the sequence loaded in. Alright, let's start with the render as it comes from Cinema 4D. Since I rendered out a multi-channel EXR, now I will need to split it into its render elements, which luckily happens with just a few clicks thanks to the split EXR script. Once I confirm the layout, it will generate all these loader nodes and assign the proper render elements for each of them. Okay, let me quickly go through the render elements and we can see their contribution to the final look. The atmospheric one does most of the heavy lifting, bringing me closer to the mood I was after. And of course the individual light elements help quite a lot to emphasize certain details. Alright. Once I've got the lens effect set up, I can now add the defocus node and hook it up to the Z-depth in our EXR. As you can see, the depth defocus node has quite a few settings to dial in, but once you pick up your focal point and decide on how blurry your foreground and background should be, the rest comes down to minor adjustments. Okay, before adding the Gamut node for the final export, I tend to do a very subtle vignetting and added just a tad of film grain. Which helps a great deal with getting rid of that CGI digital sharpness and blends everything nicely together. And finally, add a Gamut node to specify your output color space and hit render from the render queue on the deliver page. Alright, so in this not so short video we have covered the Metalness workflow in vray, how we can create custom textures for it in Quixel Mixer, and finally how a post-production might look like in DaVinci Resolve. As always, let me know what you thought about the workflow in the comments below, and see you in the next one.